We would like to dive deeper into this approach, how to evaluate this approach, how to evaluate nature to reverse biodiversity loss, and to learn more about its applications. And again, let me invite you to ask your questions by using the Q&A tool, and please rank also the questions of others, so we can take the most important questions to most of you. Professor Nele Lienhoop will be the moderator of this session. Hello, good morning, Nele. You are a geographer by training, and you hold a master's degree in environmental and resource management, and you're also the founder of Factor Nature, which is a consulting agency at the crossing of nature and politics, so very close to what we've heard before. And you're also a professor of economics at Bochum University of Applied Sciences. So you know both teaching and consulting and measuring. And well, I'm looking forward to your panel. I'm looking very much forward to what we learned now. Over to you, Nele. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm very much looking forward to our session as well. Welcome to the four speakers and to the audience. Yes, it's the first scientific session in this conference, and it's about valuation. Just a very few words. Valuation is quite important in this context of biodiversity protection, because only if we know the value of biodiversity loss, or in other words, the costs of biodiversity loss in monetary terms, for example, it is possible to consider loss of biodiversity in decision-making, for example, in decisions on land use change, in decisions on polluting activities, decisions on exploiting natural resources. And in this session, we'll take different angles, viewpoints on this valuation approach, and we will start in the first presentation with an economic perspective on concepts, applications on valuation. This is a presentation given by Martin Quaas. Then we take a broader look, a broader perspective on valuation. Jasper Kenter will also take in knowledge from other social sciences and tell us something about how relational economists would value biodiversity. And then we move on to a strong application paper, which is about valuation or taking account of biodiversity loss caused by food production. How can this be expressed in prices for food? And finally, we look at how biodiversity loss is perceived by the general public, and how does this perception increase action for biodiversity protection. I would like to start with the presentations now, and Martin, you will start with your presentation. Martin Quaas is professor at the IDIF and University of Leipzig, and he will give his first presentation on concepts and applications of valuing natural capital.
Okay, yeah. Thanks a lot. I would like to say that I'm also not in general talking about concepts and applications of valuation, but my focus will be on on valuing natural capital. And if we go to the next slide, I would like to start with a short reference to the IPBES values assessment in which I participated as a lead authors. If we go to the next slide, please. It makes a lot of sense to reflect on the diversity of values that nature has. IPBES develops a typology of values that starts with the worldviews, then goes over broad values and specific values. These are instrumental values, intrinsic values, and relational values. We will hear more about especially relational values later on, to value indicators, including monetary values. For an economic valuation, this reflection of IPBES on different value types is actually not so important. And the reason is that economists do usually not ask where individual values come from, but they take these individual values as given and derive from this the societal values of nature. A second key, or one key message of the IPBES valuation assessment, is that nature has many and diverse values that should be recognized. And this message is very much in line with economics. It is a long-standing result of microeconomic theory that the economic value of a common good is the sum of all individual values. If you go to the next slide, one example of a common good ecosystem service is the recreational value of forests, and I will come back to this example later. If you go to the next slide, all of you, at least who have a training in economics, know that economists represent preferences, individual preferences, which are the basis of economic valuation, by indifference curves, like shown here in this diagram. This can be done for common good ecosystem services. Using these indifference curves, we can express the value of the common good ecosystem service here on the horizontal axis in terms of a numeraire good. There you can think of the expenditures for private goods measured in euros. If you go to the next slide, the value. So if we there we have one particular point here on this indifference curve, and then if you go further down the slide, two further, please. And one more, please. Right. So the value, or more specifically called the compensating surplus for the individual that we consider here, whose preferences we consider here, of an increase in the common good ecosystem service, is the maximal amount of the numeraire good, so of the good on the vertical axis, that the individual would be willing to pay while staying exactly on the same indifference curve. So these lines indicate for the increase in the common good ecosystem service on the horizontal axis, how much the individual would be willing to sacrifice in terms of the numeraire good. That's the value that we take. If we then proceed, the value per unit increase of the common good ecosystem service is given by the slope of the indifference curve in the current point. And now we can consider more, in this case here, two individuals, in order to assess the value of the common good ecosystem service for society. Here we can draw a diagram that is similar to the Edgeworth box that people trained in economics know from the microeconomics courses. The difference to the normal Edgeworth box is that both individuals enjoy the same amount of the common good. They can both enjoy recreation in the same forest, and that means that the total available quantity is the same for the two individuals. The total available quantity of the numeraire good, of the private good, by contrast, need to be split up among the two, and that means we can draw another coordinate system with the indifference curve of the second individual, here shown in green. But this indifference curve, of course, then starts from the origin in the top left corner. They intersect at the current allocation. Both consume the same of the common good, and individual one consumes the amount of the numeraire good that goes from the lower vertical line to the point where the two curves intersect. And the second individual consumes an amount of the numeraire good that goes from the upper horizontal line to the point where the two intersect. Now we can ask, what is the overall economic value of an increase in the common good ecosystem service? And then if you please click to the next slide, it is the total amount of the numeraire that both individuals jointly are willing to pay in compensation for the improvement in forest recreation. As the diagram shows, it is a sum of the two individual willingnesses to pay. The thick red bar is the sum of what the individual one would be willing to pay and individual two is willing to pay. So that is the economic version, if you want, of the IPBES proposition. Nature has diverse values, here in this case, values for the two individuals, and all of them should be taken into account. And more precisely, the economic value for a common good ecosystem service is the sum of individual values. If you then go on, we can measure the willingness to pay as the amount of the numeraire good people are actually willing to give up for enjoying the natural common good. Could you please proceed to the next slide? Thank you. One approach is to measure the time and expenses that people spend to visit a forest for recreation. This is what my colleague Marek Giergici and co-authors have done for Europe, and in particular also for Germany. They estimate a value of 25 billion euros per year that people are spending to visit forests for recreation. That includes the value of travel time in this case. And it amounts to about 300 euros per person per year. This is much higher than the revenues of timber harvesting in German forests, which is about 3 to 5 billion euros per year. But of course, for those who own forests, the benefits of timber harvesting are much more important than the recreation opportunities they individually have in the forest. So the recreation value is large, but spread over many. The timber value is relatively small, but concentrated for a few. If you proceed to the next slide, please, using a discrete choice experiment where people have been asked about the willingness to travel to forests with different characteristics. So you see this here visually depicted and also described graphically, and they also differ in the distance that needs to be traveled to visit them. Giergici and co-authors also showed that people strongly prefer older and more diverse forests. So the results you see on the next slide, please. The willingness to travel increases with the height, and that means also, of course, the age of the trees. And it is also larger for mixed age forests and for forests that contain dead wood. Valuing ecosystem service, in particular the common good ecosystem services, as I've shown here, is an important step. If you please proceed to the next slide, more properly, ecosystems are understood as assets that deliver a whole suite of ecosystem service at a time and that deliver those ecosystem services over time. A forest, for example, provides wood and also provides recreational amenities as long as the trees stand there. As using wood diminishes recreational amenities, it is important to take the natural capital perspective, which is also emphasized by the Dasgupta review on the economics of biodiversity. Please go to the next slide. Natural capital is best valued at shadow prices, which capture the social value of an extra unit of the natural capital stock, for example, an extra tree or an extra hectare of forest. This means in particular that it includes all benefits that the forest provides. It includes the timber benefits, the benefits from wood harvesting, and it also includes the recreation value and other values that the forest provides to society, like also carbon storage and biodiversity maintenance, climate regulation, and so on. The social value then is obtained as the present value of all these ecosystem services, all these ecosystem benefits. If you proceed, please, to the next slide. As the values for common good ecosystem services show, so where we need to use this valuation studies, this value usually cannot be directly obtained from market observations, but rather we need models in order to compute the present value of future ecosystem benefits. Computing this present value consists of two steps. One is to quantify the value of the ecosystem services depending on the state of natural capital. I've shown how this can be done, how the benefits of forest recreation can be measured as a function of the state of the forest, in particular the stand age, how mixed the age structure, size structure is, and whether or not dead wood is included. That state of the forest, of course, depends on how the natural capital stock will develop, and of course on ecosystem management. So that needs to be projected in order to know what might be the future value of ecosystem services. And if you go on to the next slide, these models need to combine the ecological dynamics of natural capital with economic valuation and optimization. Here's an example of such a model for a forestry that is based on a forest demographic model. And in a proof of concept, we have applied this forest demographic model with economic valuation and optimization for a beech-dominated forest in Thuringia. The map is shown on the next slide. So that's in central Germany, and you see that it is primarily beech. There's also some other hardwood included. Now, here are results in the next slide. There are results from this model. They show that the natural capital value of trees, that's the vertical axis here, the results, depends on the amount, the current amount of the natural capital. That's here shown on the horizontal axis. The more forest there is, the higher is the natural capital value. That is true for the market value of trees, essentially the present value of future timber revenues or net revenues. That's the lowest line. It's also true for the shadow value of the natural capital stock forest, which and that includes on top the recreation value of the forest computed or estimated as I've just shown. This value is smaller if the forest is managed only for the market value of timber revenues. That's the red curve, compared to the case when the forest, which we can compute in the model, would also be managed in a way that takes the recreation value in account. That would be, or is termed here as the Pareto optimal management. And that gives a higher social or shadow value of the natural capital stock because it would leave larger trees and allow for more deadwood in the forest. On the next slide, please. Let me come back to the start of the talk, but now in the natural capital perspective. The current value of common good ecosystem services at any point in time depends on the relative scarcity of the ecosystem service versus the produced numeraire goods. If you click on one further, what we expect to happen over time is economic growth. That means that the endowment with produced goods will increase. Not so the common good ecosystem services, at least not to the same extent. And if biodiversity continues to decrease, it would even decrease. And that means if the ecosystem services are normal goods, they will become more valuable if the future amount of produced goods it's getting higher, and more of the numeraire good accordingly is consumed. And so that might even go on. If you click on the first slide, you see that over time, with more and more consumption opportunities for numeraire goods, the relative value of the common good ecosystem service will increase for all individuals who have preferences over this. And this needs to be taken into account for natural capital valuation. And the next slide is my conclusion slides. I would like to conclude here. Have the three main messages on the slide, and would like to thank the Value Gaps team. That's the project that is funded within the FEdA at IDEF and the partner institutions, and would like to thank the biologist forest modelers at IDEF and you for attention.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was a very interesting talk, and I'm thinking of giving you the opportunity to ask questions of understanding. Maybe we can spend 1-2 minutes on this now using the free questions and answers tool. All discussion questions have to wait until the end of the sessions, where we have about half an hour to discuss all talks in one. So I just check whether there are any questions of understandings at the moment. Not so far. That's a good sign. Then I would like to move on. And I invite Jasper Kenter
Yes, it's really nice to be here and to see kind of many familiar faces and many unfamiliar faces. And I'm going to really pick up where Martin has left off. So it's kind of, I think, a very interestingly designed session. And like Martin, I was also part of the IPBES values assessment. And so I'll kind of cover really kind of another kind of angle and approach to valuation that builds on that, but also links back to some of the kind of work that he presented. So as you kind of gathered from kind of Martin's session, and he picked up on, is that in environmental valuation of nature, kind of focus on valuing natural capital and ecosystem services, the way that is typically approached is by thinking about values as individual preferences. And whereas social values, the value to society as a whole, is then considered as the sum of individual values, expressed as those preferences. And those values, when they're expressed as preferences, are thought of as instrumental. They're a means to an end. And nature is important as a means to an end, and is as such kind of substitutable and commensurable. So if there's something important about nature, in principle, that should be substitutable with something else that could give the same level of preference satisfaction. Now, of course, many of us building on ecological knowledge kind of recognize that's often not the case with nature, that we're kind of often fundamentally dependent on natural capital, and those kind of fundamental assets are often called considered in terms of things like critical natural capital. So that kind of nuance of commensurability and substitutability of nature is very well recognized, I think, in environmental economics. But nonetheless, within the kind of social perspective of what values are, there's less kind of theoretical recognition still that values are can often be poorly substitutable with each other. And I'll come back on that. And then finally, what's kind of so helpful about this kind of approach of understanding values as individual preferences, as instrumental, and as commensurable with each other, is that it allows for optimization. And kind of Martin already kind of spoke to that. If we can work out the strength of preferences, we can turn them into a monetary quantitative metric. We can assess those preferences. And then kind of work out across society what everybody thinks is important. Then we can work out optimal solutions or rank different kind of possible policy options or policy solutions in terms of their social value, in terms of the degree to which they satisfy preferences in aggregate. So a very elegant solution, and I think this is one of the reasons why this kind of approach has had an appeal for such a long time. Another advantage of this approach is that it allows then optimal solutions that are kind of environmental or that involve nature conservation to be compared with other options. And that it's then often possible to show that options that promote nature, natural capital, ecosystem services, things like green infrastructure, can often kind of both save costs and increase social value more efficiently than kind of conventional options that don't conserve nature. And that then allows you to make the policy case for it. So I'm making a whole kind of spiel about this conventional approach, and that it has a real kind of potential to support environmental decision making. However, we also end up in situations like this, situations where there has been a cost-benefit analysis, where environmental values have been to some degree monetized. And nonetheless, the outcomes of that kind of aggregation of individual preferences does not seem to align with social values, and we end up in a situation of conflict. So this was 10 years ago in the UK, when the British government wanted to privatize a good part of the national forest estate. It was not so long after the financial crash. There was a kind of an austerity agenda. There was an idea of kind of how can we reduce public debt? Well, we'll just sell off lots of kind of collective assets. And the economics kind of to some degree supported that, and those assessments had been done. But the shared values of people came into play, and there were huge protests. And eventually, after more than 1 million people responded to a consultation, as well as all these various kind of local protests happening, the decision was reversed, and it became a kind of political embarrassment. And after that, within the UK, there's certainly been an increase in recognizing, these conventional appraisal methods and ways of working out what is socially optimal from an economic perspective have their drawbacks and their limitations. And these tend to come out in particular situations where there are complex stakeholder interests, where there are multiple values that are perhaps difficult to monetize, such as the relational connections that people feel with their local forests, and also where maybe kind of less so in this kind of case, but in another kind of environmental issues, when the evidence can be contested and there can be uncertainty around what are the real environmental implications and then the social consequences of a particular policy option. So coming back to IPBES, if we're then thinking about values in their plural way, so Martin already talked through this, we think about values both in terms of specific values, the judgments regarding the importance of nature in particular situations, and as broad values, where values are considered as guiding principles and life goals. Some of work of my team in thinking about kind of how does nature play out in terms of all these different values in the way that we frame or think about nature is kind of fed into this framework where we consider nature through 4 different kind of spotlights. Where we live from nature, thinking about nature as resources. We live in nature, thinking about nature as place. We live with nature, thinking of nature as an important other, which may be conserved, but which can also have kind of negative implications for people. And we think of nature as self, nature as a part of us, or ourselves as part of nature. And all these different spotlights kind of highlight what kind of broad and specific values are emphasized most within that way that nature is framed. And so when we think about the conventional approach, in a way we kind of think of nature primarily from this living from perspective. We think of nature as a resource, quite anthropocentric perspective. The kind of questions that come into play around broad values are things like prosperity. How can we maintain our prosperity whilst still conserving nature, or how can we conserve nature in a way that also enhances our prosperity, and also values like efficiency that come into this. And then when we think about kind of value indicators, biophysical, monetary, social-cultural indicators, there tends to be an emphasis on the biophysical and monetary indicators and perhaps less on the social-cultural. Coming back to this question and of value pluralism, when we think about this framework, what does value pluralism mean? Well, we value different things to different degrees, but there's also multiple types of specific values, multiple indicators, multiple broad values, and these are not necessarily commensurable with each other. There's multiple ways of framing nature, and there's multiple underlying worldviews and knowledge systems underneath that. And then there's also multiple providers of values. Values can be provided by individuals, but as you saw from that example from the UK, the aggregate sum of those individuals does not necessarily align with the values expressed by groups or by communities or societies or cultures as a whole. So there's many different aspects of value pluralism. And I'm going to be making the case, and I'm going to be talking about some content that's from a draft paper, which is under review in PNAS at the moment, that a shift towards a more relational approach to an economics of biodiversity can help to address that value plurality more broadly. There's been a relational term in broader environmental management and valuation across different kinds of disciplines, certainly an increase in interest and also a kind of an increased kind of pulling together from really kind of decades and sometimes centuries of academic work and thinking that's kind of brought in different ways of thinking about relationality, and that's gradually coming into the environmental field and also starting to percolate into valuing nature. But having said that, even though it has penetrated this broader kind of field of valuing nature and is very well reflected in things like the IPBES values assessment, when we're thinking about economics, this kind of more relational perspective hasn't fully penetrated into that field yet. Relational values are recognized, but the broader kind of relational term and underlying relational concepts aren't as prominent yet. They don't fully integrate with that kind of perspective on individual, instrumental, commensurable preferences. And so kind of this leads then to a challenge of kind of, well, how do we do that? How do we bring in that more relational kind of perspective? And there's been kind of three kind of strategies to more integrating that relational perspective and more broadly integrating pluralistic values within the economics of biodiversity, or EOB, as I just put it here for short. We can stretch the standard environmental kinds of economic approaches, like using choice experiments to recognize relational values, but then express them as individual preferences, like in the example that Martin gave. Or we can combine approaches in environmental economic valuation with more diverse sociocultural approaches. So we could combine approaches like choice experiments or value transfers or natural capital assessments with more sociocultural approaches from other disciplines, like kind of qualitative methods in geography or other kinds of approaches. And then somehow kind of combine those in integrated projects, which we could call integrated valuation. But that doesn't fully really kind of integrate those values within the economic assessments themselves, bringing in these kind of questions of, well, how do we address the scarcity of resources, but then consider the relationality as a question within that question of how do we consider scarce resources and how to allocate them across society. And that, I think, requires ways to broaden the scope of values within the economics of biodiversity through more unconventional approaches. And as I will say, that also provides opportunities to better bridge values and challenge some dominant institutions that can get in the way of kind of moving beyond situations where we end up in those contexts like the conflict in 2014 that I mentioned, but where we also start to more deeply integrate those relational perspectives in the way we think about values themselves, which the IPBES values assessment has identified as a deep leverage point for societal transformation. Unfortunately, there's only limited examples of this so far in practice, and there's also a limited conceptual integration. And the rest of the next few minutes, I will just kind of talk to that question of conceptual integration first.
Yes, but you have 2 minutes to go, yeah?
2 minutes. Okay, so I have 2 minutes to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to pick up that relationality is more than relational values. It integrates different strands of critiques around value monism, instrumentalism, individualism, and optimization. And they could integrate broader debates around these questions of individuality and around instrumentality. Whereas this perspective on relational values is more saying, okay, well, we don't just have instrumental values, we also have a more relational understanding of values perspective. But what I'm trying to talk about is also moving towards a more relational understanding of ontologies, epistemologies, etc. So we've developed a framework for what an economics of relational economics of biodiversity could look like, and how that contrasts with this more conventional model. And we've identified that across the layers of this IPBES values typology. So in terms of the life frames, thinking about multiple life frames, thinking about human-nature relationships more pluralistically. In terms of worldviews, moving away from a narrow emphasis on anthropocentric worldviews and dualism towards recognizing more pluricentric worldviews and moving beyond dualism towards more holistic perspectives where we see people and nature as more interconnected rather than as kind of in that Cartesian separation. And that has the implication then that economic relationships need to be considered also through a social and institutional lens, as well as being ecologically embedded. In terms of knowledge systems, considering deeper integration between different knowledge systems. In terms of broad values, considering them much more explicitly rather than as just assuming that they're being reflected in individual preferences. And when doing that, thinking of them in a pluralistic way, and also then thinking about that policy questions are really not so much about identifying efficiency between different sets of preferences, but really around how do we actually satisfy multiple broad values relating to the environment, relating to social questions, relating to justice, and relating to things like prosperity as well, the more traditional kind of broad values that are implicitly reflected in economics. In terms of specific values, thinking of values as more than preferences, also thinking about capabilities, needs, and rights, and thinking about values as always being expressed within a relational context, and that includes instrumental values. And then finally, thinking about values as intersubjective. And then an emphasis on pluralistic value indicators and different kinds of approaches that allows us to bridge different indicators, like multi-criteria approaches, deliberation, participatory appraisals. And thinking about indicators also as that they're often context dependent because of that relational embeddedness. So the policy implications of this, when we move towards more relational economics of biodiversity, I'm going to round up now, Nele, are that we need to move towards a more participatory form of economic assessment in order to recognize that relational context of assessment of all values, including instrumental values. And that allows us then to develop methodologies like deliberative valuations as a kind of boundary object between science and policy, where really we're doing research, but we're also recognizing that the research that we're doing ultimately relates to kind of normative questions, because the way that we appraise values, the way we actually think about how do we do valuation, has some normative implications in that. Do we focus on efficiency, which is a broad value, or do we focus on a broader set of broad values that we want to assess through that more participatory, more relationally oriented valuation? And that means that essentially some of the political questions kind of have to be made explicit within the scientific assessment. And that then relates to a recognition that knowledge is not produced in this kind of neutral space. And of course, we could do a whole other talk on this, because there's many kind of political ecologists and institutional economists who speak to this. Valuation knowledge has a strategic nature, and we need to recognize that when doing economic appraisal. And we can make that more transparent by thinking about a relational economics of biodiversity. And that then also allows us to think about how does valuation not just elicit some sets of values that can feed into existing decision-making mechanisms, but how can we start to develop these more participatory appraisals, these more deliberative valuation boundary objects, as ways that we can actually integrate broader sets of values within decision-making as a way of leveraging deep transformation points. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jasper. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just have a quick look whether there are questions of understanding. Not so far. Welcome, Lennart Stein from the University of Greifswald. Hello, Lennart. You're going to give a presentation on true cost accounting for food. You can start.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thanks also to Martin and Jasper for your very interesting input. So yeah, welcome to my presentation. It's titled Increasing Biodiversity Through Cost Accounting for Food. So my name is Lennart Stein, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Greifswald, a researcher in the FEdA project Homable, which you can see on this slide as well, and as well for the EU Horizon project, Food Cost, which also deals with true cost accounting at the TH Nuremberg. Today we will explore how true cost accounting can serve as a transformative tool to maybe also address biodiversity loss, and practically in the agricultural and food sector. So I was a little bit sick the last day, so I hope my voice will make it through the whole talk, but I'm looking forward to it. Okay, let's have a really quick focus on our agenda. So it's mainly structured in 2 parts. First of all, I will give an overview about the topic of true cost accounting, the relationship between agriculture and biodiversity laws, as well as some methodological fundaments. And in the second part, I will give you some insights into a campaign we did with Penny in the last year, so a true cost campaign all over Germany, and some first scientific results about it. And in the end, I will give you an outlook about how maybe to implement true cost in practice. And I think that's also always a good thing to discuss about in the end. To make the relationship between agriculture and biodiversity less abstract and to underscore like the necessity and potential of true cost accounting, I would like to briefly discuss the global distribution of land use. So as we all know, only about 30% of the Earth's surface is now covered by water. Of this land, 71% is considered habitable land. So as we can see, agriculture accounts for 46% of this habitable land, making it the single largest land use category. So this is significant. Share highlights the central role agriculture plays in shaping our planet's biodiversity. Even this simple breakdown underscores like the potential impacts and also the increased transparency. By better understanding the environmental costs associated with agricultural land use, we can leverage substantial opportunities for improvement through informed decision making. And this becomes even clearer when we look more closely at agricultural land. And that's the reason I want to focus on it, because my talk is about food. So of all agricultural land, 77% is used for livestock, including meat and dairy production. However, these products contribute only 37% of the global protein supply and just 18% of global calorie intake. So this, I would call it imbalance, highlights the inefficiency of current land use, where a large amount of space is devoted to activities that yield relatively low nutritional returns. Such practices not only limit the land availability for biodiversity, but also drive habitat destruction, ecosystem and biodiversity degradation, which are major contributions to the ongoing loss of species worldwide. So this is where true cost accounting becomes a vital tool, in my opinion, because assessing and internalizing the environmental impacts of agricultural practices, TCA provides a clearer picture of the true cost associated with food production, and this approach can highlight the effect. This is why I want to give you a very short introduction about true cost accounting. So what we can say is market prices are not the true prices. What does true cost accounting do? It takes into account the costs incurred by society as a whole. In addition to the direct production costs, which are market prices at the moment, environmental and social costs are included in prices. But what can true cost accounting do? I would refer to this 4 steps from TMG research. So first of all, it identifies material externalities. In the second step, it measures the external effects. Thirdly, it evaluates their effects and makes them comparable. And last but not least, we can report. TCA is a reporting and information tool that results in a comprehensible stakeholder-related form, for example, towards policy, towards companies, and even to consumers. But what do the research results on true cost accounting in the food sector tell us? So in 2020, our team published an initial study that clearly illustrates the core findings of TCA in agri-food value chain as shown in this figure. So on the left, you see animal-based products such as meat, and the middle dairy, and on the right, plant-based products. Within each category, conventional products are on the left and organic products on the right. The findings here are very clear. So conventional animal products have the highest identified externalities relative to their market prices, while plant-based products show the lowest. On average, of course, there are some products where it does not apply, but organic products perform better than their conventional counterparts. So over the years, the methodology includes more and more impact categories. I will show you on the next slide. But I really wanted to show this picture because the key results and the key findings of true costs stayed the same. It just got more detailed. So on this slide, you can see an even more detailed TCA methodology. We can see different parts like not only global warming, but also terrestrial acidification. We can see fine particulate matter and so on. So it shows the percentage contribution of various indicators to the externalities for conventional and organic production, for example, of wheat and cattle in this context. For comparison, the value for conventional farming practices is set to 100% externalities in each case. And thus, depending on the category, it can be seen for which farming practice the externalities are higher and how the process contribution of the indicators change depending on the farming practice. So the main findings of the study are here for the wheat production. So fertilizers have a significant influence on the externalities of conventional production. Fertilizers influence also organic production, that comes, for example, from lime, and also lower production rates of organic production results here in more land use. For the cattle or beef production, we see a significant contribution from plant products grown before the actual lifespan of grass. And I think it's very interesting to get more into detail here, but I will just give you a broader overview. If you have specific questions for products and so on, I can send you some of our publications as well. Why or where is like the relationship towards biodiversity loss? So the recipe 2016 methodology, it's pretty common in the context of true cost accounting, was also used in our recent updated paper, Michael et al. 2023. So this provides 18 impact categories to evaluate the ecological impact of production cycles. So 10 of those impact categories are directly related to species loss and extension. So I mark them here. Therefore, TCA can help to reveal the costs of biodiversity loss, although there is no explicit indicator, of course, for the phenomenon of biodiversity loss included. But furthermore, effectively reducing environmental externalities would therefore also mean to mitigate biodiversity loss. But let's get more concrete and have a look on TCA in practice. So in cooperation with Penny, where we calculated all the true costs, 9 products in more than 2,000 stores in Germany were labeled with true prices during a campaign week in the last summer. So we calculated the presented environmental impacts, which we communicated as 4 different damage categories. So climate change, health, soil, and water. The additional income generated by the sale of true costs additionally to the market prices were donated to the Zukunftsbauern project. The campaign week was completed by additional research. So over 2,000 participants were surveyed before and after the campaign. The sales figures for the campaign week were analyzed with a reference to comparative periods and products, and we are at the moment also doing a comparison with data from the GfK, so from whole Germany and other retailers from that time period. And we did a media analysis as well, because this campaign really brought the true cost of food in societal and political discussion, which is from perspective of science communication pretty important in this case. So I will show you some findings which are under review at the moment and only shared at 1 page in the new FAO report, which was published at the beginning of November, as well in some press releases of the project in the beginning of this year. So here we can see the different products. So we had fruit yogurt, always organic and conventional. We had sliced cheese, mozzarella, sausage, and vegan schnitzel. Yeah, we can see the highest externalities, of course, for the sausages. So the true costs are marked in orange. The base price, or it's written here, is like the market prices you would normally pay. And the true costs are added on this. So we have also quite high prices for sliced cheese, a little bit less for the organic part, moderate true cost prices for fruit yogurt and mozzarella, and very low externalities for the vegan schnitzel. But what did it do to the sales actually? And I think that's a very important aspect, because based on price elasticities, we expected very high declines. Penny also expected this, but let me explain the charts very briefly. So we see campaign week in the center. So here, the previous week was just over it, and we see a sharp drop here in the conventional sausages. As a comparison, we see the difference curve at the bottom of this slide. Compared, we see on the right-hand side the organic sausages, and I think that's very interesting, because this is significantly lower for organic, which was not expected to this extent. So we attribute this also to the scientific campaign around the TCA campaign. And a very interesting product from our perspective is the plant-based product, because we had a price increase, of course, the lowest of all products, but we had a 5% price increase. And we can see that we did not have a decline in sales. We even had more sales. So even at the beginning, after Monday, it stayed the same. We had more sales. And it's very interesting from an economic perspective, because you would never expect sales increase after such a campaign. We think that's maybe because persons who are interested in this campaign and wanted to buy a product, of course, choose like the product that's the cheapest or has the lowest externalities, and also the science communication campaign we did towards the campaign maybe plays a role here, but this will be figured out in more detail in our next paper with some colleagues from Stanford. To give you some more insights and also the survey, as I mentioned, we asked more than 2,000 persons before and after the campaign about their attitude towards cost accounting in general, and how they think high behave of externalities for different products and so on. But one aspect I would like to show you here very briefly, we asked them, are you interested in, after them, of course, giving some information about true cost accounting in general, what it means and so on. We asked them, are you interested in having in-store information about true cost accounting? And before the campaign, we mentioned, yeah, we are interested in. Are you interested in having like a surcharge with like a donation? Yeah, they were interested in. Are you interested in to implement true cost accounting in like governmental tax? And all these aspects for policy support got lower support after the campaign. So after they were confronted with what it really means for them, that they have to pay maybe for it at the checkout when buying groceries, the support for these policy aspects decline. I think that's very, very interesting, and also comes to the next slide, like how we should implement TCA. So of course, we see it's a very good tool to communicate true costs, but we cannot say or cannot recommend from a scientific perspective, okay, let's put all true price tags in all supermarkets all over the world tomorrow, because it's not feasible, and it's also not possible from a societal part. So we did some studies also about how to implement it. We did a study at the beginning of this year, which we focused on maybe we can implement TCA somehow with an adapted value-added tax. It's also possible to integrate it in externalities into corporate accounting. And of course, TCA is an information tool not only for consumers or companies, but also for politicians. So if you have the knowledge about value chains and what are the most harmful parts regarding environmental externalities for value change, this should be the basis for new legislation, especially at European level, CSRD, CAP, and so on. And also, yeah, we can create transparency in the value chain with TCA information, because at the moment we do not have real transparency. Yeah, I hope I could give you some very rough insights into true cost accounting in our research. And if you have any questions, just contact me, or we can continue these aspects I just showed here in the discussion later on.
Thank you very much, Lennart. That was a very interesting talk. I see there are no questions of understanding at the moment. Annike will give us a presentation on perceptions of biodiversity loss and how it affects action in biodiversity protection. Yes, right?
Yes.
Okay, you can get started, Annike.
Okay, I hope you can see my presentation.
Yes.
And thank you very much for the nice introduction. I am Annike Eylering from the University of Osnabrück, and I'm working as a PhD student at the Department of Biology Didactics. And the last years I dealt with the study of perception of biodiversity loss, and I would like to introduce you in 3 different studies. And let us start. So first of all, I would like to show you this figure of Verissimo et al., who shows that people influence biodiversity in various ways, as an individual or an organization, directly or indirectly, and this leads to biodiversity loss. But one question which is often unresponded or little researched is how does human perceive the biodiversity loss? And this is what we investigated. So starting with our study 1, we investigated 3-word associations of biodiversity and its loss. And today I will only focus on biodiversity loss. We used the theoretical framework of social representations, which describe the system of values, ideas, and practices. And these representations help individuals to organize their social environment and to help communicating within their social groups. To tell this in simpler words, it is to familiarize the unfamiliar. And the best way to gain social representations is to assess 3-word associations to get an unrestricted access to mental representations of people or public or social groups. For example, if you give people the term or the stimulus bird, they will probably think of fly, feather, chirping, and so on. But biodiversity is a fuzzy concept, ill-defined, and different defined in every group, such as economics or scientific definition. So what we did is to ask the German public what they think of when they, or what they associate when they think of biodiversity loss. So perhaps you can start thinking what you will associate when you think of biodiversity loss. We did an online questionnaire in 2021 and asked the German public with the question, what associations come to mind when you think of biodiversity loss? People from the German public, for example, think of species loss, climate change, butterfly, bee extinction, bad, sad, and so on, to name just a few. But they also think of human, maybe as a part of biodiversity, or maybe as an influencing factor, a negative or positive one. To summarize, what we found in the study 1 is a wide-ranging understanding of biodiversity and its loss, whereby the social representations reflected a positive, negative view, social dimension, and also scientific dimensions like ecosystem diversity or genetic diversity. These associations networks we used showed how people organize their thinking, which words are connected, and especially we had seen that the climate change as a key driver of biodiversity loss was present. However, something like invasive species or land use change was underrepresented. And these are also major causes of biodiversity loss. Or if I think at the talks of of the people before, economic values were less present. Okay, moving on to study 2, people's perception of biodiversity loss, validating a scale. Only in the last decade, research has started to focus on perceptions of biodiversity loss, and different studies use different definitions of perception, and they use different survey methods. And our aim was to develop and validate a comprehensive scale that measure public's perception of biodiversity loss. So to this end, we collected data in 2021 from the German public and asked them different things. So we used a study from a colleague of the Netherlands, Anne van Valkengoed, who validated the scale to climate change perception. And they ask if people perceive the biodiversity loss in our context as real, human-caused, bringing negative consequences, and if these consequences are closed in space and time. And every of these dimensions include 5 items at all. Maybe you know it already, but to validate a scale, there are many steps required, and this is a very technical process, and I do not want to describe this in detail, but just to give you some insights. For example, convergent validity is to investigate if the scale correlates with similar topics or scales, or discriminant validity refers to if the outcoming results of the scale is similar between, for example, men and women, or differs between people with different political views. In summary, our scale shows that all validity checks are fulfilled, and we can say that we add a new scale, the biodiversity loss perception scale. To summarize the study 2, the first point is that we have a valid tool to measuring public's perception of biodiversity loss with 5 dimensions. And if we take one look at the descriptive results, we can see that in Germany, the perception of biodiversity loss is relatively high. For example, if you look at reality, the first one in a row, you can see the midpoint is over 6 on a Likert scale from 1 to 7. So in general, we can say the German had a really high perception of biodiversity loss in our study. Okay, finally, let's take a look at study 3. In current research, there are different studies identifying psychological influencing factors on pro-environmental behavior. These are emotions, risk perception, values, and these are valuable predictors to pro-environmental behavior. But what is not investigated yet, or very less, is the investigation of psychological factors on biodiversity conservation behavior. So in the third study, we aim to investigate this. For this, we did an online questionnaire in 2022 in 3 different countries, in Germany, the UK, and Spain, with approximately 440 to 450 participants. Now I will shortly introduce you in our psychological factors, and starting with biospheric values. These includes people's concern with the environment and all living beings. For example, an item is, it is important to him or her to protect the environment. Second, we use the biodiversity loss perception scale from study 2, and an example item is, I believe that biodiversity loss is real. Third, we use the emotional part of perception, the biodiversity loss anxiety, and we ask participants if they feel tense or anxious when they think of the biodiversity crisis. And lastly, our dependent variable, the biodiversity conservation behavior, which could be subdivided into 2 dimensions. In our study, these are civic engagements such as voting behavior or gardening activities such as I will provide food for animals or I will plant pollinator-friendly plants. This brings me to the results. Due to the time, I will only show the results of the German public and starting with biospheric values. Biospheric values had an influence on all biodiversity loss perceptions, which means the person who holds strong biospheric values is more likely to perceive the biodiversity loss, for example, as real or bringing negative consequences. Going one step further, we can see that biospheric values are an important predictor of biodiversity conservation behavior in both civic actions and gardening behaviors. So a person who has strong biospheric values is more likely to vote for an environmental organization. Let's move on to the biodiversity loss perception. Only one dimension, bringing negative consequences, had an influence on civic actions. So that means people who perceive the negative consequences of biodiversity loss are more likely to engage in civic action. And lastly, the biodiversity loss anxiety, which shows that a person who is anxious about the loss or feels tense is more likely to engage in civic action. The model in general showed a good fit, and I would like to summarize also these key findings from study 3. We had a validated BALOPS now in 3 languages, in German, Spain, and English. And we identified important influencing factors on biodiversity conservation behavior, whereby emotions and values are consistent predictors in all 3 countries. And we also can see differences and similarities between the countries in case these are all Western countries of Europe. So the differences are very small, but I think it's very useful to highlight these cross-cultural research. Okay. To conclude, I hope you agree that perception of biodiversity loss matters a little bit to understand the underlying conceptions of humans in regard to the biodiversity crisis. And this brings me to my end of my presentation. This was a really brief wrap-up of my 3 studies of the last 3 years. Thank you for listening, and yeah, I'm open for questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Annike. That was very interesting, and you did a good job in putting your 3 studies into one short presentation. We now have about 15 minutes for a final discussion, and while you type in your questions into the question and answer field, I would like to pass on one question to you, Annike, that has already been placed. And Ina Säumel asks you whether you could just provide us briefly with information on the representativeness of your samples that you used in the survey.
I have a quick answer. We used quotas from the Statistical Federal Office for age, gender, education, and income, and tried to regulate the quotas with our panel provider that we have a nearly representative sample. I hope this answered this question.
I guess so. And there's a question to Lennart from Volker Moosbrugger. What would happen if you would just inform the consumer about the social cost, external cost linked with the product? Possibly the impact on society would even be higher. Can you tell us something about that, Lennart?
Yeah, so the question is if we only do like informational campaigning and not really have to pay for true costs at the checkout, right? Okay, I guess so. So this is how I understand the question. So we did actually a case study about this because there was a first informational campaign, which we also did in one penny store in Germany in 2020 in Berlin. So a sustainability store, and we only had like a second price tag. So on the left side of the price tag, you see the market price, and on the right side, you see the added environmental and social prices. And we did a lot of surveys about it, and there was a lot of willingness to pay for environmental prices, not like for the whole environmental price, because as I just showed you, these are really high, sometimes even like 100% add-on and so on. But in the area between 25 to 50%, there was a willingness to pay or a willingness to accept these aspects. Or is the question more about the societal aspects behind true cost accounting?
Okay, I guess that answered your question. Thank you very much, Lennart. Unfortunately, in this sort of setting, we cannot get any feedback.
Okay, sorry for that.
The person who asked the question.
question.
So there is no real discussion possible. But there is a new question in.
Maybe okay, I just read the question of Volker. Sorry for interrupting you.
Okay.
Maybe just a small add-on, because at the moment we're also focusing on health aspects of food, and I think that's really interesting if you have this as an add-on for communication, because if we are only focusing on environmental aspects, persons are often very egoistic, and so if you're confronted with the health impacts it has on your own body, but it's a whole different story. So I think this will also have impacts within the next years of true cost accounting research, and also on how to implement it. And I think it's also more into like the emotional communication about foods, because in the end, if you compare environmental costs and health costs, the results are the same. So red meat is worse for environment, and it's also worse for your body, for especially. So I think this is also just one aspect I wanted to add to this question to Volker.
Yeah, thank you. That was a very important aspect. Thank you very much, Lennart. A question to you, Jasper, came in by Johannes Schiller. He says, you highlighted very important aspects, which I sympathize with. Thank you. I see, however, practical challenges. Does not all that get very complicated because we have to interact with a lot of local people? Could you give some practical ideas on how to incorporate relational values in decision-making in an easy-to-use way? That's a good question, I think. We would all use it.
I think there's a couple of other questions as well that kind of relate to this broader question of kind of how do you apply it, implement it, and how do you deal with things like, I thought that was a very interesting question, you know, kind of, what about when there's different scales of social values? So a local community would want to, it's a Volker's question here, you know, where local community would want to save the forest, the national community said, well, you know, we'll plant some production woodland to feed a power plant and help us meet our net zero targets. And these are, of course, these are really big questions. Of course, they don't necessarily get answered by conventional economics either, because it's always a question of kind of what's the scale of economic standing? Who do we account for when we add up the values of individual values? At what scale do we do that? And who do we include in that? So it's a more general question than just for kind of relational or shared values kind of based approaches. And of course, I could do another presentation for an hour on the kind of methodology that we could use, but ultimately, the question is kind of whether it gets very messy. Yes, it does get messy. Do we explicitly recognize that or not? Or do we go into a stage of kind of first we pretend it's not messy and we can answer it through optimization models, then inform the decision makers and they come to some kind of conclusion. But when they ignore these broader sets of values, then it gets messy, and then you go for a whole kind of complicated political process and end up with U-turns or the decisions being enforced on people. I think that really these kind of approaches are appropriate when there is a likelihood of conflict, when there is a lot of uncertainty, when there are a lot of stakeholders. So really when it is already a bit messy. If it's a relatively straightforward problem, I think, so the aggregation of individual values is probably a good approximation for social value. But the more complex and the more contested it becomes, the less and less that ends up being the issue. The question of that question of scales, then, it's not one that you can really fully answer. Ultimately, it's more of a political question of kind of to what degree do we account for local people's rights and values as opposed to national interests, and that's more of a matter of a political debate that you can integrate into deliberative valuation. But I think the kind of potential for more deliberative and participatory methods are really interesting, and will also influence what people are willing to pay. I'm just kind of thinking about Lennart's work on true cost accounting. If you bring that kind of, I thought it was really fascinating and a valuable piece of work, Lennart. But what came up for me is a question: well, if you go to people and ask them, well, how do you think this money should be spent, and how do you think people should be compensated on a low income? I think that how those questions would be answered would really influence the degree to which people would support that. So it's a great example of kind of how you can actually combine more analytical work that you do with potential work and deliberative work to think about the institutional dimensions to deliver something really transformative.
Yes, thank you, Jasper. I have a lot of questions to you too, but I will give, I don't ask them now. I will first allow the audience to ask questions. And one question is going to Martin. And it's about your optimization tool. And it says it's by Nadja Simons from the University of Würzburg. Optimization tools including different sources of income, for example, timber production versus tourism in forests, only make sense if the outcomes are transferred to the same stakeholder, for example, to the forest owner. Do or can optimization tools also include incentives or compensations provided to the stakeholders? Can you say something about that, Martin?
Yes, of course. I'm happy to. So I think, first of all, I should say that my emphasis was on the economic values, and I was presenting the economic values in those tools. But I think it's important to recognize that that when it comes to decision making about biodiversity, there are many more aspects that need to be considered, and I think Jasper has put forward a few of them. Now the question is, what is the purpose of this kind of analysis? Again, it was one particular perspective, the economic one, and it's an analytical tool. So as such, it is not meant to do anything immediately, but it can be put into discussions about what ought to be done. And one of the discussions is, as you said, there may be the idea that one would compensate landowners for changing their management of a forest, say, reduce the amount of timber that's taken out for the benefit of biodiversity and, for example, recreation values, and how much an appropriate compensation would be can be determined by means of an optimization model of this kind.
Okay, thank you for this nice and comprehensive answer. I just check what else we have here. There is a question to Annike. The question is, how was chemical pollution perceived as a driver of biodiversity loss? That's number one. And the second question, was the perception of the term biodiversity different across sectors, for example, between businessmen or researchers? Great study, thanks.
Thank you for the question. I had a look at the association network again, and I mentioned that only pesticides was mentioned, and in the network there were only associations visualized which were mentioned at least 5 times. So to answer question 1, I think chemical pollution is not at all perceived as a driver and is less present in mental representation of German public. Hope this answers question 1. And the question 2 is a very nice idea for further research. In our study, we only visualize a network for the German public at all, but I think it is a great idea to investigate different social groups, which is also the aim of social representations, to investigate social groups and to design perception maps for example businessmen or researchers to compare these different representations. But I have no concrete answer to this.
Yeah, okay, thank you. There's a follow-up question even to you, Annike. Do we need to change the way we communicate biodiversity? Although at least in Germany, the general awareness seems to be high, but how do we achieve more engagement or a higher acceptance of biodiversity measures, especially in turbulent times like this?
I think this is a very difficult question to answer. Regarding the results of our studies, I would say we should appreciate the right range of understanding of biodiversity and not only focusing on, for example, scientific definitions such as genetic, ecosystem, and species diversity. So people are able to have a lot of more present representations of biodiversity. So in communicating biodiversity, I think we should focus on the wide range and use the fuzzy concept or open the fuzzy concept and use not only the 3 scientific dimensions of the popular definition. And to answer the second part of the question, yeah, I think this is the case why we sit here in the conference to make biodiversity awareness high. And I don't have a concrete answer, but regarding our results, I think it is important to focus on values and emotions on people's perception.
Okay, thank you, Annike. I have 2 more questions on my list, and this should be the last ones because we have only 4 minutes left. If you have further questions, please just address them to the talk to the speakers in the lunch break, for example. There are many opportunities during this day and tomorrow. 2 questions by Herwig Unnerstein. Lennart, one is in your topic. How can the TCA approach be used for refining shadow prices to identify recreational value?
It's a tough question. So somehow it's also a question we are addressing, for example, at the food cost project in the EU project. So where we are focusing on, okay, there are a lot of different TCA methods and we have to standardize them and think of, okay, how we can internalize them. Yeah, maybe I think the answer would be somehow longer. I think I will write down an answer during the lunch break and also give some references towards it. I think otherwise it gets too much detailed in this case. I hope that's fine.
Okay, so it's Herwig Unnerstein you have to contact.
Yeah.
Okay.
I will comment on this FEdA. I think that's
yes,
possible.
very good, very good.
Very good question, actually. Yeah, thanks.
The very last question, I guess, goes to you, Jasper. What is the added value to use participatory evaluation over representative surveys?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of different kinds of added values. The first is that from a relational perspective, there's more opportunity for integrated context. So I think we know very well, really, from this developing relational values field, but also this much broader, longer existing field on relationality, that people's way of relating to the environment is very contextual. So generalized large-scale indicators don't really reflect that very well. And of course, having more participatory approaches allows you the methodology kind of dig deeper at those values and understand them better. The other is more from a perspective of participation, that when there is a kind of well-designed participatory process that links research into the decision-making process, there can be more legitimacy for the decision. It can improve the quality of the decision because more people's values can be considered in this broader way, and that may mean that people feel better reflected within that decision. So I have a practical example at one point where we were dealing with conflicts between fishermen and conservationists in some marine management issues, and we went through a very elaborate participatory process. Even though we couldn't reach consensus because there were some fundamental conflicting issues, we were able to integrate a lot of the values that arose within that process from all different stakeholders within the final management measures for the marine protected areas that we were talking about. But even the people who didn't quite got their way reflected on that they appreciated the process and accepted the outcomes because they felt they had been heard and participated. So it does reduce the chance of conflict for participators by increasing that quality of decisions. But like I mentioned before, there's obviously also a cost to these processes, and that cost is more and more worth it when there's more chance of conflict and more uncertainty, when it's a bit more of a messy or wicked kind of issue that you're dealing with.
Thank you, Jasper. I saw a last question came in. Laura, can you please match up with Lennart in the networking session, because we are now running out of time. It's 12 o'clock now, it's lunchtime. I would like to end the session now. And I would like to say thank you to all speakers. It was very interesting and a pleasure to listen to your presentations. I hope to see you later on in the conference or another day. Have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.